There is one continent on Earth where you cannot go without permission. Not because it's dangerous, not because it's privately owned, because 54 nations that have spent centuries competing for territory, resources, and influence, agreed without public vote, without public debate, to place it under a single international governance structure that has no equivalent anywhere else on the planet. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in Washington, D.C. on December 1st, 1959. 12 original signatories, negotiated in 18 months of closed-door sessions, no public hearings, no General Assembly debate, no referendum in any of the signing nations. The treaty prohibits military installations, prohibits nuclear testing, prohibits resource extraction, designates the entire continent as a scientific preserve. And it was signed 14 months after the United States Navy conducted one of the largest military operations in peacetime history on that continent, an operation whose full findings have never been declassified. The operation was called High Jump. What they found on that ice is the question the treaty was designed to stop people from asking. Let's establish the facts first, because the facts alone are remarkable before any interpretation is applied. Operation High Jump was authorized in August 1946. It was commanded by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, the most decorated polar explorer in American history, a man who had made 4 previous expeditions to Antarctica and was, by any measure, the foremost expert on the continent in the United States military. The operation deployed 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea, 33 aircraft, 3,700 military personnel. This was not a scientific expedition. The United States Navy does not deploy aircraft carriers and 4,700 troops for geological surveys. The stated mission was to establish a permanent base, test military equipment in polar conditions, and conduct aerial photography of the continent. The operation was planned for 6 to 8 months. It ended after 8 weeks. No official explanation for the early termination was provided in the public record. 3 men died, 6 aircraft were lost. The Navy's own after-action report, portions of which remained classified for decades, described encountering conditions that the official summary characterized only as, and these are the words in the declassified summary, unexpected and of a nature requiring immediate reassessment of mission parameters. That language appears in a Navy document, unexpected, nature requiring immediate reassessment, on a continent where every expedition for the previous century had been encountering cold, ice, and wind. What does cold, ice, and wind require the United States Navy to immediately reassess? The aerial photography mission did produce results. Over 70,000 photographs were taken. A substantial portion of those photographs were classified upon return. The unclassified photographs showed Antarctic coastline, ice formations, and standard polar geography. The classified photographs have not been described in any public document. We know they exist, we know they were classified, we do not know what they show. In March 1947, Admiral Byrd gave a press interview before departing for South America. He stated, and this is on record, reported in the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio on March 5, 1947, that it was necessary for the United States to take defensive actions against enemy aircraft coming from the polar regions. The Cold War had not yet formally begun. The Soviet Union's Air Force did not operate polar routes to the United States in 1947. Byrd's statement has been attributed to early Cold War anxiety, to confusion, to mistranslation. It has never been explained by anyone with knowledge of what the operation actually found. Now hold the following sequence in your mind, because the timeline is the argument. 1946 to 1947, Operation High Jump, largest peacetime naval deployment to Antarctica in history. Terminated early, findings partially classified. 1955 to 1958, Operation Deep Freeze, a follow-up American military operation in Antarctica, also commanded in its early phases by Byrd, officially described as preparation for the International Geophysical Year. Its full findings remain partially restricted. July 1958, the United States detonates a nuclear device in the South Atlantic, approximately 1,000 miles from Antarctic coast. The operation is called Operation Argus. It is classified at the time. It is not acknowledged publicly until 1959. October 1958, preliminary negotiations for the Antarctic Treaty begin. December 1959, the Antarctic Treaty is signed. 14 months between a classified nuclear detonation near Antarctica and a treaty that prohibits nuclear activity near the continent without any public acknowledgement that the United States had just done it. The nations that signed the treaty in 1959 agreed to prohibit something that had already happened, that they were not told had already happened, in the same location they were agreeing to protect. That is documented. That is not interpretation. That is the sequence of events. Most people who have heard of the Antarctic Treaty assume it is a straightforward scientific cooperation agreement. Read the actual text. Article 1. Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. Military personnel and equipment may be used for scientific research or any other peaceful purpose, but their presence must be notified to all treaty parties. Article 2. Freedom of scientific investigation shall continue. Article 7. Each contracting party shall have the right to designate observers to carry out inspections. Observers shall have complete freedom of access at any time to any or all areas of Antarctica. That last article is interesting. Complete freedom of access for designated observers, but only for observers designated by contracting parties. A journalist cannot invoke Article 7. A private researcher cannot invoke Article 7. An independent scientist not affiliated with the treaty party cannot invoke Article 7. The freedom of access guaranteed by the treaty is freedom of access for governments to inspect other governments, not for anyone else. Article 10 requires all contracting parties to discourage activity contrary to the treaty. That means each signing nation is legally obligated to prevent its own citizens from conducting unauthorized activity in Antarctica. The treaty does not merely restrict access, it requires the signing nations to actively enforce that restriction on their own populations. This is not standard scientific cooperation language, this is governance language. The Antarctic Treaty is structured less like a scientific cooperation agreement and more like a framework for ensuring that no individual, no private organization, and no non-member state can independently examine what is on that continent without going through a system controlled by the original 12 signatories. The original 12 signatories were Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Notice what is missing: China, India, Brazil, the entire continent of Africa beyond South Africa, the entire Middle East, Southeast Asia. In 1959, these were not small nations. India had been independent for 12 years. China had been the People's Republic for 10 years. Brazil had a larger population than any European signatory. They were not invited. The treaty was negotiated and signed by 12 nations, 11 of which were either Western powers or aligned with Western powers, plus the Soviet Union. The nations that signed controlled, between them, the majority of global military and economic power in 1959. They signed an agreement governing a continent that none of them owned on behalf of all humanity without consulting the majority of humanity. The standard defense of this is practical. Only these nations had active Antarctic research programs at the time. That defense answers a different question than the one being asked. The question is not why these nations signed. The question is why the governance structure they created was designed in a way that made independent examination by non-member states effectively impossible. Today, 54 nations have signed the treaty. The original 12 retain special consultative status. Decisions about what can be done on the continent require consensus among consultative parties. The 12 nations that negotiated the treaty in secret in 1959 retain structural veto power over Antarctic governance in 2024. There is one development that makes all of the above more urgent than it was 10 years ago. The ice is melting, at rates that Antarctic researchers describe as historically unprecedented. Between 2002 and 2020, Antarctica lost an average of 150 billion tons of ice per year, according to NASA satellite data. That melting is exposing geology. Rock surfaces that have been covered by ice for thousands, in some cases millions of years, are becoming accessible for the first time in recorded history. In 2016, a team of researchers examining newly exposed rock on James Ross Island published findings describing geological formations whose origin they could not explain through standard glacial or volcanic processes. The paper was published in the journal Antarctic Science. It received minimal mainstream coverage. In 2018, a separate research team using satellite imagery identified what they described as anomalous subsurface structures beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, structures too regular in their distribution to be explained by known geological processes. That finding was published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters. It also received minimal mainstream coverage. Neither of these papers claimed anything beyond what the data showed. Neither used the word civilization. Neither made claims that exceeded their evidence. And both were published in peer-reviewed journals by credentialed researchers and then quietly filed away. The ice that covered whatever is on that continent for centuries is retreating. The governance structure that controls who can examine what is revealed was put in place 65 years ago, in secret by 12 nations without public vote. And those 12 nations retain structural control of what gets examined, what gets published, and what gets classified today. I want to be precise about what this video has and has not claimed. It has claimed Operation Highjump was terminated early with no public explanation. It has claimed a classified nuclear test occurred near Antarctica in 1958, 14 months before the treaty was signed. It has claimed the treaty was negotiated in closed sessions without public debate. It has claimed the original 12 signatories retain structural veto power over Antarctic governance today. It has claimed peer-reviewed research has identified geological anomalies on the continent that have not been resolved. Every one of those claims is sourced. Every one is documented. None of them requires speculation to state. The question is not whether these things happened. The question is what connects them. An early terminated military expedition with classified findings, a classified nuclear test, a treaty negotiated in secret 14 months later, a governance structure that has controlled access to that continent for 65 years, and ice that is now melting, exposing geology that has not been seen since before the treaty existed. The sequence is documented. The question of what it means is the one the treaty was designed to make very difficult to answer. Drop a comment. Which of these facts surprised you most? And subscribe because the next video goes into the specific classified photographs from Operation Highjump that researchers have been trying to access through FOIA requests for 20 years.